Okay, hello again. The third and final session of tonight. Now, I've read these three conditions, three types of lesbian texts. The first and second categories here seem inadequate as they stand, and since merely writing about books and or about gays is clearly not enough, since gayness is not being defined as an inherent, essential, unchanging category. A solution may be to adopt an approach which is historically specific. Thus, gayness in a novel or an author of the 1920s is not the same as in the 1980s or 1990s. So in 1920s it was more difficult to express sexual identity, lesbian identity or gay identity in literary texts, and for many years, in many centuries, it was very difficult to do so. But after 1980s, it became easier. On the third category, critics need to be aware of wider metaphorical extensions of gayness. For instance, the suggested link between lesbianism and the state of being poised on the threshold between categories. In general, lesbian critical reading proposes the blurring of boundaries between self and other, subject and object, lover and beloved as the lesbian moment in any text. Yet, this third category also has obvious risks, notably that gayness will probably assume too great an emblematic burden, since it all tends to be romanticized and stand as a textual emblem of resistance and disruption of all kinds. All right, what we need to point out is that the difficulty of preferring that kind of identity, the difficulty of feeling yourself in that kind of identity, and not only in social life, but also the difficulty of expressing that identity in any kind of literary text. And a final and more specific literary consequence of anti-essentialism is a tendency to devalue literary realism, since it tends to rely upon notions of fixed identities and stable points of view. For instance, a realist novel typically has an omniscient narrator who presents and interprets the events from a fixed moral and intellectual position. So in a realist novel, especially the conventional fiction, we have a third-person narrator, so the writer isolates himself or herself from the other characters in the book. So there is also a linear time sequence in which events unfold chronologically, and characters who are presented as stable essences with a personality which develops in an orderly, cumulative way. So then, in most of the conventional novels that we are used to reading, the narrative is in the third person. The narrator is an omniscient and omnipotent narrator who knows everything and who is always everywhere at all times. And then he or she isolates himself from the other characters in the book. But lesbian gay criticism of the recent queer theory tends to favor texts and genres which subvert this kind of familiar literary realism, like thrillers, comic and parodic fiction and sexual fantasy. It was very easy for those conventional literary texts, because of the third-person narrator, to isolate yourself as the narrator from the sexual identity. But now, in the postmodernist novel, And in the modernist novel, first-person narrator came into being, and when the author narrates the story of a gay person or the story of a lesbian character, then he is usually identified with the character. Thus, a novel like Jeanette Winterson's Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit is of interest to the lesbian gay critic, not just because of its lesbian subject matter, but also because of its many anti-realist elements. So then the early feminist writers preferred an anti-realist standpoint to isolate themselves from the literary realism and indirectly talked about the sexual preferences. Okay, what do lesbian and gay critics do? How do we read the texts? First, identify and establish a canon of classical lesbian gay writers whose work constitutes a distinct tradition. There are, in the main, such as Virginia Woolf, Vita Sackville West, Dorothy Richardson, Rosamund Lehmann, and Radcliffe Hall. Identify lesbian gay episodes in mainstream work and discuss them as such. For example, the relationship between Jane and Helen in Jane Eyre, rather than reading the same-sex pairings in non-specific ways, for instance, as symbolizing two aspects of the same character. So we first identify and establish a canon of lesbian gay writers, and second, identify lesbian gay episodes in mainstream work, all right, if there are any in the mainstream work. And three, set up an extended metaphorical sense of lesbian, gay, so that it connotes a moment of crossing a boundary or blurring a set of categories. All such liminal moments mirror the moment of self-identification as lesbian or gay, which is necessarily an act of conscious resistance to established norms and boundaries. Then, we try to find out, as literary critics, we must try to find out that are there any elements of anti-essentialism in the text? Are there any elements of which stand against the heteronormative values in the text, or which give us the depictions of non-heterosexual relationships in the text, even the connotations of them? Number 4, we must expose the homophobia of mainstream literature as critics. Expose the homophobia of mainstream literature and criticism, as seen in ignoring and denigrating the homosexual aspects of the work of major canonical figures. For example, by omitting overtly homosexual love lyrics from selections or discussions of poetry of W.H. Auden. And foreground homosexual aspects of mainstream literature, which have previously been glossed over. So even in mainstream literature, we can find the homosexual aspects. It's easy to find them, and they have been glossed over. For example, the strongly homoerotic tenderness seen in a good deal of First World War poetry, because there in the First World War poetry there's brotherhood and the brotherly love, but there's also a closeness, affectionate approach to the same-sex people, between the same-sex people. Because the foregrounded masculinity, even among men, the foregrounded masculinity, according to the lesbian theory and gay theory, the foregrounded emphasized masculinity, even among men, is a homosexual tendency. Number 6, foreground literary genres previously neglected, which significantly influenced ideals of masculinity, or femininity, such as the 19th century adventure stories with a British Empire setting. For example, those by Rudyard Kipling and Rider Haggard, discussed by Joseph Bristow in Empire Boys. Right. Even in the mainstream lighting then, even in the canonical works of English literature, we can see that kind of, we can even point out the homosexual tendencies or homosexual closeness between the male characters or between the female characters as well. And the closeness between, for example, Dr. Aziz in A Passage to India, Dr. Aziz and Mr. Fielding is, hinting on, there are hints on a gay relationship there, even though it is not expressed in the novel. There are very, very close hints at a homosexual relationship there, or homosexual affection between these two men. And also, the famous novel and the famous film called Midnight Express, by a novel by William Hayes. And William Hayes in this novel wrote about the story of an American man who was arrested at Istanbul airport, at the airport in Istanbul, because he was trying to smuggle 4 kilograms of opium, stacked with tapes over his body under his T-shirt, and he is caught by the border police, and he's arrested immediately. And in that novel, he writes the story of that young man in prison, in Turkish prison, tortured, and the Turks are described as terrible people in the novel. And in the film also, if you have watched the film, that's all. And in the novel, there are differences between the novel and the film. In the novel, William wants to have a bath in prison, and there is a general bathroom, a hammam, and he strips off, takes all of his clothes off, and walks to the hammam stark naked. And one of his American friends, prisoner also, warns him, "No, you can't go to the bath like that." "What? How can I take a bath?" he says. "No, you have to wear your short. Turks don't like naked men." Right? There's a hint that there's a suggestion that Turks are interested in naked men, so do not show your naked body to Turkish men. Then he finds this very weird, and he puts on his shorts and goes to the bath. And in that bath, his American friend, wearing a short, they are washing themselves, and there's a closeness between them. They get very close to one another, and they don't have a relationship, but there are hints at having a relationship, clues of having a relationship in the novel, and the writer doesn't cover it. In the film, however, the same scene occurs again. He is warned by his American friend to wear a short when he goes to the bath, and when he goes to the bath, he's wearing a short. His American friend is wearing a short, and his American friend is approaching him to give him a kiss, but he, pushes him back, because the audiences, the cinema audiences of the time in 1970s, didn't like such homosexual references, didn't like such gay references in the films, and it was very difficult for them. And the film was, of course, very, very much criticized politically, because it was a very racist film. Okay, if you have any questions, please write your questions to me. Do you have any questions now? I know it is difficult to write and wait for an answer. Okay, a question is coming. 2 questions are coming. Okay, who is first? Kübra or Batuhan? No, sir. Okay, not a question. And Batuhan sends me a smile, I think. Right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining me. So now I'm closing the session. I hope to see you next week too. Bye-bye. Take care of yourselves very well. Bye.